Hello and welcome to another edition of Photographica with me, Alex Schneideman. And this edition is very special for me because it features a conversation with Professor Greg Currie. Greg is a professor of philosophy at the Department of Philosophy at the University of York, but he has lectured all over the world, I would say literally all over the world, from the London School of Economics, where he started, and to University of California, Berkeley. He's worked in Australia, in New Zealand. He's been a visiting fellow of St John's College, Oxford, and at Clare Hall, Cambridge. In other words, he's particularly well qualified to speak on philosophy, but more than that, he has concentrated on the philosophy of film and the language of film and language itself. Recent books of his include Narratives and Narrators, Oxford University Press, Arts and Minds, also the Oxford University Press, and Recreative Minds, Imagination in Philosophy and Psychology. He has written recent papers on the irony in pictures, art and the anthropologist, Bergman and the film image. His dedication and his fascination with the world of moving images, in particular films, led him to record a conversation with Nigel Warburton on the fantastic Philosophy Bites podcast, which is where I first came across Greg. He was talking on the subject of the knowability of a character in film, or the truth, the literal truth of a character in film, and how the viewer perceives the characters in any film. And it was fascinating. It was a fascinating discussion, and I immediately thought how good it would be to record a conversation with Greg on the subject of stills photography and to try out some of the ideas that I have around the philosophy of photography. In particular, we start with one, which was an idea that I've been kicking about for a while, which is a sort of fascination of mine, which touches on language and where images and where meaning are formed. And it's to do with a little mind game, which I outlined to Greg straight away. He deals with it pretty succinctly, but we go on to have this excellent conversation in which Greg is at all times forbearing, he is patient with me, and he is intelligent and brings an enormous amount of wisdom and experience to the discussion. We recorded the conversation at the Groucho Club in Soho, so there's a little bit of noise in the background, but I don't think it gets too much, and it adds to the atmosphere, I like to think. I would also like to publicly thank Greg for coming on the podcast, because he really is so overqualified to be talking to the likes of me, who hasn't spent 1 minute in a lecture theatre in his life, and but would very much like to, particularly if the professors that I was to come across were anything like as generous as Greg. So without further ado, I give you Professor Greg Currie.
Greg, if I could put it to you, a problem that I've had, or something, a thought experiment that I've had, and I was walking down the street, and it occurred to me that perhaps I could construct what, to all intents and purposes, is a photograph out of words. And by that I mean, I was walking down the street very close to where I live, and there was, it's on Harrow Road, and there was, I was walking along the pavement, and on the left-hand side is a busy double road, and on the right-hand side is a laundress shop, and above the laundress shop there is a big billboard advertising cat food. It was getting dark, so the light from the laundress was shining onto the pavement, and people were coming backwards and forwards into the shop, and both on their way home and out for the evening. It was a sort of typically busy suburban London scene. And with those scant details, I was wondering if I could make a picture in your mind about what I saw that would equal in meaning that of a photograph. Should I have shown you a photograph? Now I know that a photograph would have much more detail in it, and the photograph comes with all the truth weight of reality and document. But if I'm to be taken as a reliable describer of things, rather, then could you not say that what I've just described in your mind could constitute a photograph, in the sense that a photograph has to be received visually and then has to be translated by the brain into some kind of meaning, and that on that level they're both the same thing?
So I don't think that a photograph and a description of the kind you've just given me are the same thing, and I don't think they could ever really be the same thing. I think there are some really important differences between them, and maybe we can talk about what those are in just a moment. But what may well be true, and I think what you said pointed to this, was that a photograph and a description could serve the same purpose and in certain circumstances provide me with roughly equivalent information. That wouldn't always be true. You gave me a description of a London suburban street, and you told me about some street signs and some people walking down the street. Now I can construct a mental picture of that, but I can do that partly because I'm pretty familiar already with what you're talking about. I have background knowledge that enables me to create a mental picture, something like what you were describing. But all that does depend on me having that background knowledge, and if I didn't have it, I couldn't construct that mental picture. The photograph, if you'd taken a photograph of that street, would give me a mental picture of things which wouldn't depend on that amount of background knowledge. So I think there would be a big difference between them there. But that said, for me, it could be, given my background knowledge, that the description you've given me does just as well if I, for instance, needed to meet you in that street. It might do just as well to help me find my way to where we want to go. In fact, it might do better. It might be that for one reason or another I just remember descriptions better than I remember visual pictures. So some people have good visual memories, some people don't, and I think I probably don't. And if I'd seen a picture of that street, I probably wouldn't remember very much, but if I had a description of it, I'd probably remember more. So pictures and photographs and descriptions can serve very similar purposes in certain circumstances. I don't want to say that opens a possibility for descriptions to be photographs or to be the material out of which photographs are made. I just think there are too many important differences between them for that to be the case.
Yes, in a sense it all comes back on what you call a photograph as well. I mean, that's an important part, and I suppose I didn't define what I meant by a photograph, but at the same time I'm very interested in how the visual cortex interacts with language to produce meaning. And so, and I mentioned to you in the sort of notes that I sent you, just, you know, they're pretty rudimentary as they were, that I wonder how our brains change in that way, and I wonder if a photograph has the same effect on our brains in an almost physiological way. And this is something which I'm trying to understand, because I want to understand why I'm so interested in photography. And I think that somewhere around it has something to do with with the illusion of reality and the real and whatever we could call the real effect of reality. So in a way, my attempt to create a photograph out of just using a rudimentary description is a way of seeing if I can alter the way that your brain is wired in a funny kind of way, in the same way that a photograph can do the same job. In particular, does that rewiring, if you like, happen at the same level as linguistic wiring? And that, I think, is... And is there a point where the meaning... that there's a sort of fundamental basis of meaning that we all understand, and that whether you're taught... We know that children who are neglected, their brains are wired almost irreparably into adulthood and are unable to learn. Is there something there where visual and linguistic meaning connect at a ground beneath what we call literal meaning? You know, the words that you would say to yourself. And that's, I guess, and I think, I mean, it's not that I disagree with anything that you just said in sort of breaking down my sort of proposition, but is there any merit in what I've just said, or is there anything that you can elaborate on? Or
yes, I think you're onto something there. So I guess perhaps some years ago there would have been a view which went something like this. There are some areas of the brain that deal with vision, and there are other areas of the brain that deal with language, and they are different areas. And language doesn't depend upon the visual area. But I think that's a more difficult view to hold now, if I understand recent research in this area. And there's been some interesting work done on how people depend upon the use of visual imagery to process linguistic meaning.
right.
So we know, first of all, that the visual areas of the brain are strongly implicated, this is not surprising, in visual imagery. So we all think that having a visual image of something is a bit like actually seeing it. And the reason, or one of the reasons for that, is that the same areas of the brain get involved when you're seeing something as get involved when you're visualizing it. So visual areas of the brain are implicated in visual imagery. There's a lot of evidence now that when people hear words and sentences, people talking to them, or when they read words and sentences on the page, they form mental images that are naturally associated with those words, and that's not just some sort of strange, pointless byproduct. It's actually part of the processing of language that they be able to do that. Because we find that if you do an experiment which actually interferes, and you can do this, with people's capacity to form mental images, it disrupts their processing of language. So yes, there is some evidence, and I guess it's in the end going to be a complicated story that I won't be able to tell you very much more about, that there is a strong connection between vision and language. Whether what the implications are for thinking about the relations between photography and descriptions, I think is a complicated story, but I think what you said is pretty much right.
So, if I understand you right correctly, then and I know that from some of the things that you've written about how what is it to really see something? I mean, if we watch a film, are we really seeing? You know, if I watch I don't know why this image comes into mind, a bulldozer pushing a car down the street. That must be something. Are we really watching a bulldozer push a car down the street, or are we watching a series of 24 frames per second, or if it's video, you know, then interlaced, and you know, and is our brains interpreting it in that way? And before I finish that, you know, when you said, I mean, it sounds to me like almost the way that the human mind makes meaning out of things is that we listen to language, or we watch images or something, and then do we summarize it to ourselves? Is it a sort of summarizing process? Do you think that we take a meaning and then we listen to a few words, we kind of take it into our RAM, as it were, and then to make meaning of it, we have to add a dash of our own experience, summarize that, and then store it in a sort of slightly deeper part of experience. And is that something which you would recognize as from?
So I think there's an important distinction here between two kinds of meaning. So let me very briefly say what I think that is. So we get meaning from just about everything around us. I mean, all our senses, our vision, from hearing. We see things, they mean things to us. All this is meaning. Meaning is flooding in all the time in all sorts of ways. But I think there are two importantly different sources of meaning. And they're importantly different because of the way in which they get processed, which I think is very different. So one way to get meaning is just to open your eyes and look around you and see stuff which tells you where objects are in relation to you, and that's obviously very important because you don't want to be standing next to the tiger. You want to be close to the thing that you want to eat, not close to the thing that wants to eat you. Another way to get meaning is to listen to what somebody says to you, excuse me, or what they write, or maybe the pictures that they draw. And those things give you meaning, but they give you meaning in a way which depends on the intentions of the person who's giving it to you. And that's not true when I'm just looking around me in the street and noticing that there's a car coming and I step back from the curb. That's very useful information. It doesn't depend upon me assuming anything about the intentions of anybody who's providing me with that information, because nobody is.
There's no interlocutor. There's nothing between you and it. It just is.
I'm open to the world in perception, and the world is flooding into me, and I'm getting all sorts of information from it. But if somebody tells me stuff, I have to make all sorts of assumptions, first of all, about whether I think they're reliable, whether they're trying to deceive me, and I have to make decisions about exactly what they mean when they say what they say, because people very rarely actually say what they mean. Mostly people produce a sort of truncated version of what they mean. So if I say to you, I've had breakfast, I think you'll understand that as meaning I had breakfast today, not I had breakfast at some time in my life. But of course I didn't say that. You filled that bit in because that would be a reasonable thing for me to want to communicate to you, that I've had breakfast today, and it's not likely that I'm wanting to communicate to you that I've had breakfast at some time in my life. So I think there are those two really importantly different ways of getting meaning from the world. One way which depends on the intentions of an agent, and another way which is like perception, which doesn't. Why is that relevant for thinking about photography? Well, one strong tradition of thinking about photographs in philosophical thought and in the thought of people who've written about cinema, like André Bazin, has been that the way we get information from photographs and from cinematic images is much more like perception and much less like learning something from what somebody is telling you.
So, are you saying that moving images or movies or photography avoids the mind to a certain extent?
Yeah, something like that is what people have wanted to say. Now, one of course has to be very careful in explaining exactly what that means. So maybe a couple of examples can help get the thought across. So when people hear that sort of a statement, I think they say, well, look, photographs are made by people after all. And photographs can be manipulated, and so doesn't all that stuff about people and trusting what they say come in here? Well, yes, it does in a way, but if we restrict ourselves to thoughts about what we might call the basic mechanism of photography, then there does seem to be something perception-like about photography and the information it provides. So, for example, it's possible for there to be accidental photographs. We can just set up a camera in the forest with a tripwire because we want to photograph a creature that's walking by, and when the creature walks by, trips the wire, the photograph gets taken. Nobody took that photograph, it just was a purely mechanical process. So that's one way in which photographs...
So there was no intention behind that photograph, apart from the intended
from
mechanism.
The broader intention that we should, we hope we'll get a... There's no specific intention.
Yeah, there's no
there.
author of the scene, as
That's
it were.
right,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
Another example, I think fairly telling, is this. Suppose somebody's having an hallucination and they think they see a pink elephant. Now, if they've got a sketchbook or a palette and some paints, they could sketch or paint the pink elephant. And what will appear in their picture is the pink elephant. There was no pink elephant there, but they thought there was a pink elephant there.
When you say they thought, what we're saying is that they're actually looking at, if I was
They're having
hallucinating...
the visual impression of there
I'm
being...
seeing in 3 dimensions a pink elephant, and I'm drawing it from life,
That's
as it
right.
were.
Yeah. So that you're having an hallucination, a very realistic hallucination, and you think, oh gosh, that's a pink elephant. Well, isn't that unusual? So I'll do a quick sketch of one. If it was a photographer who was having an hallucination and he decided that he wanted to take a photograph of the pink elephant, when he developed the film, there wouldn't be any pink elephant there. The photograph only shows what's actually there. It doesn't show what the person thought was there. And that's a pretty substantial difference between photography on the one hand and painting on the other, because although photography and painting are both visual media, they fall on opposite sides of this divide that I've been trying to explain, the divide between perception and what people tell us. Photographs tell us what's there, as long as they haven't been manipulated, of course, and that's possible. Paintings tell us what the person who made the painting thought was there.
And that reminds me of a Rembrandt exhibition recently where, in fact, it wasn't his self-portraits, but there were self-portraits of his there. But they were Rembrandt. It was an exhibition at the National Gallery of Rembrandt portraits. And I was made very aware of the fact that both as painter, we were seeing a representation of his mind, or at least his perceptions of reality, if you like. If he was painting faithfully, or even if he wasn't, and he was inflecting expressions or physical characteristics with his own consciously.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as a visitor to the gallery and as a viewer of those pictures, I was aware that those pictures were being formulated in my mind as well. So they didn't exist except in my mind. And so painting in that sense, and as opposed to photography, is a mind to mind medium, if you follow me. Whereas photography, unmanipulated, let's assume it's always unmanipulated for the sake of this conversation. Photography, or filmmaking for that matter, is a mechanical process of light recording through a lens, and it's almost an accidental process. As you say, an intended photograph could be considered accidental or incidental, or the recording that it makes could be considered positively incidental when compared with a painting, which is a very intentional thing and very much part of the mind.
Right. So one way to illustrate that is, I'm sure you know the film Blow Up, which hinges on the fact that the photographer has taken a photograph, which, for reasons he's entirely unclear about at this point, a lot of people have suddenly become very interested in and want to steal from him. And so he looks at his own photograph very closely, and he blows it up, and then he takes a little section out of it and he blows that up, and he takes another section and blows that up, eventually to the point where you can see that there's something that looks like it might be a body lying there under some bushes. So that what's happened there is that the photographer has taken a photograph of something that he didn't have any idea he was taking a photograph of. It was an intentionally taken photograph, but there is an accidental element there, in the sense that something is captured in that photograph of which he had no notion. But of course, with a painting, we wouldn't see the same thing. The painter puts into the painting what the painter wants to put into the painting, and he won't discover that there's a body in his painting, because there won't be one there unless he intended to put one there in the first place.
But that isn't to say that the painter might not record something faithfully as a detail,
yes,
that to which somebody else may accord great importance, such as the body in that picture in Blow.
Yes, good. So that's absolutely true. So it's perfectly possible for the painter to put paint on the canvas in such a way as to create quite intentionally a certain shape, but not to know what that shape actually represents. And that can happen fairly frequently. I mean, a painter can be mistaken about what mountain he's painting. He thinks he's painting one mountain, actually it's a different one. So he didn't know what he was painting. What he did know, of course, was that he was painting something. And that's the difference between the photograph and the painting. The painter put that shape in, if he did put it in, as a deliberate act. The photographer didn't put that thing in as a deliberate act, and didn't have in the least idea that there was any shape there in the photograph. It's only when he discovers it and blows it up that he sees that it's there.
And so is that a problem, the unintentionality of a photograph? Is that a problem for its status as an art form in that sense? I mean, in the sense that people, I mean, something I've written about is in Britain there is an antipathy to, a natural innate antipathy to photography as an art form, and it's always been hard for me to put that into words. But I wonder if this is something at the bottom of it that it's a question of human interpretation. It's a question of a photograph is not necessarily the greatness accorded a great photograph was not necessarily attributable to the person who made that photograph, because there was no intention in it. It was luck and mechanics.
So there's a famous article by Roger Scruton, who you probably know about, who argued some years ago pretty much what the view that you've just outlined, that photography cannot be considered an art because of its mechanical nature. And he says, look, you can see an interesting object, and I could go over and put a frame around that object. But in putting a frame around the object, I haven't created an artwork. I've just drawn your attention to something that's interesting out there in the world. And really, according to Scruton, that's what photographs do. They just put a frame around a bit of the world. And if there's anything interesting about a photograph, according to Scruton, it's the thing it's a photograph of, not the photograph itself. Whereas with a painting, you can have a very interesting painting of a completely uninteresting object. So painting is an art, photography isn't an art. Now, that's the view. I don't think many people accept it. I'm interested that you think that there is a general antipathy to photography in this country, and I perhaps wasn't aware of that, but that could very well be the case. But I don't think that many people who've considered this really want to take Scruton's view very seriously.
I think that Scruton's view belongs to an older age when we didn't know how to look at photographs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when you take a picture now, when I take a picture now, I know, or I think in the back of my mind, that it's going to be read, but looked at by visually literate people, which I take for granted. And so that there are intentions in the photograph which I'm making subconsciously, and when I look at a picture, and we can come back to this, but I believe that photography is larger, is really could be broken down into data capture and editing, and the data capture is the is a necessary function of photography, and the editing is actually is the most important part of the photographic process. But that when I'm choosing pictures, a picture which I find has merit is a picture which, on some level, I understand will have merit to other people who see pictures in the same way that I do, and have the same connection with it. So, I don't want to give too much credence to Scruton's theory of photography and art, because I think it's very rudimentary to say, by taking a picture, you can't make an interesting photograph of an uninteresting thing. You can't make an interesting photograph of an uninteresting thing in the way that you can make an uninteresting thing into an interesting thing through a painting. That, in fact, with the photograph, it is all about the intention of the photographer, and the intention of the photographer is exactly the same. It works on exactly the same level as that of the artist, or of a more traditional painter. It is still to produce a visual narrative of a scene, whether that's abstracted or literal. I mean, I'm leaving aside any kind of so-called realistic photography, such as photojournalism, something where relying on, which is more evidential, relies on, for its power, on evidence, as opposed to form and texture and covert meaning, by which I mean the language of form and texture as we understand it. So Scruton's understanding of photography is rudimentary in a world which now has absorbed photography and its meaning completely, and its intended meanings and its unintended meanings. So I don't think that we can say that Scruton's theory of the uninteresting frame bring anything better, well, say anything for photography now, not in the way that I understand photography and the way that I look at other photographs. I just want to give a little bit of background on why I think that Britain is has antipathy to photography. We didn't have a great popularizer of photography as America did. You know, we didn't have an Alfred Stieglitz in the UK. And very briefly, Alfred, just for the purposes of this, and I think it's relevant to the potential chasm at the centre of the argument for photography, is that Stieglitz allied photography, which had been pictorial to that point in 1917 or so, which had been very much in the realm of the pictorialists, and he allied it to the now burgeoning modern art movement. And he did that in New York by clever means, and by opening up galleries opposite contemporary art fairs and things like that. So he put it into the same place. We didn't have that here. We were never invaded. We were massively destroyed in the Second World War. We didn't reconstruct our industries. We never saw the beauty of mechanics. They were always just a necessary tool of the elite. So the mill owners and the people of power and money only saw mechanics for their pragmatic reasons.
Right.
And lastly, of my last point is that America has been photographed right from the point of the Civil War onwards. So it cannot divorce itself from photography. So it has absorbed the meaning of photography without question. It is absolutely necessary to the story America tells itself. Photography just couldn't be separated from America's story of itself. So I think that it's very well for Roger Scruton to take a view which owes more to a time before photography was invented or ever became anything, even the pencil of light, than it does to the 20th or even the later 19th century or even the 20th century and now the 21st century. So that's a little background on where I think that we lack something in British discourse.
That sounds right. I don't know much about it, but it sounds right. I think I would just say about Roger's view, which I suspect he doesn't any longer hold, that I think, although I don't agree with it, and I don't think many people do, I think putting it the way, in the stark terms he did, was a useful device for making us think hard about photography and what the real value of photography is and what is distinctive about photography. So I'm kind of glad that he wrote in that way. I think it's helped us to think about the problem of photography. I think the simple answer to his challenge is to say that there is a dimension to photography which his analysis simply leaves out, which is that there is not just a what is represented of photography, but there is a how things are represented in photography. And the interest of a photograph, as opposed to the interest of the things photographed, is very much to do with the how things are represented. And of course, how things are represented in a photograph can vary enormously and can be highly dependent upon the intentions of the photographer, and can be a very interesting trace, maybe that's not a great word for it, of the intentions, the mind, the perceptions, the outlook of the artist, in somewhat like the way that painting is a trace of the mind. I think when you were talking about Rembrandt, you were sort of saying something along these lines, that what we are, part of the interest of a painting is that it tells us not just about the things that are represented in the painting, but it tells us about the mind and the activity of the painter, and that can be a very interesting and inspiring thing. And I think that photography, in its own different way, can do that as well.
Yes, and I think that I'd just like to echo what you said, that it's very useful that you brought up Roger Scruton's argument, because again I think it does speak of a cultural attitude, as that has existed, possibly exists less now, but it's useful to go to the centre of the argument, as it were, which I feel existed at one point, and as you say, I think probably doesn't exist now. But also this idea of where does art live, if you like. If you're watching a film of a street scene, it has no narrative.
Yep.
To what extent is your interpretation? Okay, there's a street scene, and a child runs out into the street, and there's a car coming along, and your point of view is such that you feel the jeopardy of that child, the danger of the scene, so you feel emotionally involved. It provokes human reactions in you. To what extent is the mind part of the film? The same thing, that to a certain extent the film doesn't exist except as a received series of images on our visual cortex, and then things that we've already discussed go into play and how we make meaning out of that. But is there a shared meaning, or is it a one unidirectional, which I suspect it isn't, but people take films differently. But that very simple description I gave you, do we have to bring ourselves to that description? We can't just sit there and receive it, dead, as it were.
So there are some things that we see in film which I suspect produce pretty uniform responses. There is a scene in a film which I was reminded of by what you just said, and it's in De Sica's wonderful film Bicycle Thieves, which is just a wonderful neo-realist film in which there's an enormous amount of reality, for want of another word. I mean, it's filmed on the streets. There are sort of incidents that happen in it which then don't really lead anywhere. You think, oh, this is going to be important, but actually it isn't. It's just stuff that happens. And there's a scene towards the end where the hero, if that's the word, is walking with his little boy, and as the little boy crosses the street, he's nearly run over by a car. And you can see that the car has really come, very worryingly close to the little boy. And I guess what happened is that just happened. And that was just something that they photographed, and they kept it in the film because it's a moment that registers the vulnerability of human beings,
and that we all receive in the same way.
I guess, I guess my reason for thinking of that example is that I think pretty much anybody seeing that scene is just going to respond in pretty much the same way. You sort of recoil with horror because the little boy has nearly been run down by the car, and there's not any other way to respond to that. But of course, if there's a complex scene between two characters, people can take sides, and they can take different sides, and we argue about what was happening, and we respond to it in different ways. So there isn't just one way, and I guess that would if there was just one way, that would be a kind of impoverishment of the medium. We think of film as a very rich medium because it allows divergences of interpretation and response that are highly personal to the person who's watching.
Could that be separated along the lines of, say, more intentionally art cinema as opposed to the more, the blockbuster? They work on different. They work on different levels, and people I quite like films where nothing happens, for example. You know, I quite like being immersed in a scene where really very little happens. Other people absolutely hate that. In The Mood for Love, I don't know if you very long film, very little happens. I enjoyed every second of that film. Whatever sensibilities I brought to it, I brought myself. There wasn't anything that I could share necessarily with a random other person. Let's say that we both sat next to each other and watched. I grabbed somebody off the street, watched this film. I couldn't have predicted that they would enjoy that film. What I could predict is that they'd be wrapped up in the moment of the child almost being run over. You know, that we can all share that sort of thing. So there's we bring different things, we watch in different ways, or we absorb, we engage in different ways.
I guess it's right that there is a spectrum of film styles or genres or productions which goes from the, as you call it, the blockbuster, where the viewer is guided down a fairly narrow range of responses because you're being presented with conflict between obviously good and obviously bad characters, and lots of physical interaction and lots of physical danger, and so your responses are pretty much pre-programmed, to the other end of the spectrum where everything is very, very ambiguous indeed. And I guess we tend to think of the Bergman and the Antonioni existing at this end of the spectrum, where you've really very little to go on, and you feel as if you're sort of sailing on a sea that without any kind of compass, and things could go any way. And I guess people respond to those sorts of things in very, very different ways.
I guess where I'm trying to draw you is towards an idea of mine, and other photographers I've spoken to share this idea, is that we the viewer, that is, not the maker of an image, are in our own ways the maker of the image, because we construct that image in our visual cortex, and so it doesn't exist without our perception. I mean, it's sort of quantum in that sense, that by looking at it, we make it, if you see what I mean. So whilst there are predictable triggers that you can put into a film or a photograph, pornography is a classic one, violence, anything that the red tops will usually choose, their picture desk will trigger certain sort of things. There's no nuance in there, let's say, but unwittingly perhaps, and without knowing it, they are working on a level which obviates our involvement in constructing the image and making up our own minds about, not making up our own minds, it's about how we create that image. If I feel sad, I mean, one of those Rembrandt paintings, and I can't remember its name, it's a lady with a plume, and that may be the title actually, but it invoked in me a sort of a beautiful sadness. I can't really describe it any better than that. Rembrandt didn't put that there, but there was something in the form of that painting that provoked this sensation in me, and I saw it in a way that physically, I think you could almost say the things I noticed, the glow of the paint, the whatever it was, it provoked in me a sense that somebody else wouldn't necessarily feel. And that's what I'm trying to get to, is a theory of the viewing mind being as important, not in the inception of an artwork, but in the life of that artwork, in the validity of that artwork. I mean, you could apply that to film, photography, anything.
So I think there's two ways to go on this, and I prefer one way, but let's just be clear about what the two ways are. So there's a very famous film theorist called David Bordwell, who wrote a book called Making Meaning. And his view is pretty much the view that you've just put, which is that the meaning of the film or applies to other things as well, but in his case the film is something that the viewer constructs, and different viewers will construct different meanings. So the meaning of the film is not in the film, it's at least partly in the viewer, and there will be different meanings for different viewers, and that's one view. I find that not a very helpful way of thinking about things. I think I want to say instead that the film or the painting or the photograph or the novel exists independently of the minds of the people who are the audience for it, that it has a meaning which is independent of those viewers and audiences. That meaning, of course, will be in various ways incomplete. It will be supplemented by the experiences of the viewers and the audience, but the work itself is something that lies outside of the audience. There is just the one film, there's the one painting, the one novel, the one photograph, and they can be responded to in different ways, and are intended to be responded to in various ways very, very often. And those responses are important, and they are what makes the film or the painting a great work. But those responses lie outside the film itself. In a way, I wonder whether, I mean, this sounds like a sort of big debate between me and Bordwell. In a way, I kind of think, well, I'm not sure it matters which way we come down on this, because I guess in the end we sort of probably don't disagree about the important and interesting stuff. I mean, we agree that about what's on the screen. We agree about how people respond and what's important about how people respond. We then disagree about how we want to sort of divvy that up, but maybe that doesn't matter all that much.
No, I instinctively, I think I agree with you. Okay, so two more things I'd like to discuss. Firstly, and I'm going to spring this on you, but what's the difference between colour and black and white?
Well, I guess, I mean, I want to avoid saying obvious things like there's no colour in black and white films and there's lots of colour in colour films. But in terms of why it's an interesting distinction, so I mean, one issue that's been discussed a bit recently is the issue of colorization and whether that's a legitimate thing to do, and of course it's been quite a popular thing that black and white films have been colorized, and I think a lot of people recoil from that, and I recoil from it myself. Why? Well, to restrict yourself to black and white is, or at least was after a certain point when colour came in. Before that it wasn't a choice, but after colour came in, restricting yourself to black and white was a choice that an artist made. And it's a choice that artists make now. They make the choice of having their photographs or their cinematic images black and white or in colour. And that's a choice which needs to be respected. We wouldn't go up to a sculpture and say, well, it's a pretty good sculpture, but I don't like that bit there, so I'll just take a chisel and knock that bit off. And that's really what colorization does.
Yeah.
You do something which goes against the choice that the artist made.
And I suppose in a sense you could say that well, even if it was made before the choice of black and white
Yeah.
and colour was available, to colourize something is to alter the agreed way that it was made
Yeah.
in the first place,
Yeah.
even without a choice. Even
Yeah.
without a choice,
Yeah.
it was its meaning.
So it would be like taking a painting and turning it into a hologram. Now, of course, the painter in earlier times didn't have the choice of making a hologram, but it would still be a bad thing to turn a painting into a hologram, because you're just turning it into something that it isn't.
One of the things that I was sort of think about a lot is because I can choose, as a photographer, I can choose to shoot in black and white or colour now, and as a contemporary artistic decision to make, not least of which film and digital have rampaged through the minds of photographers for the last 20 years. But there is a reduction in the information conveyed by black and white, which increases the power, the emotional power of a photograph. I mean, this is a sort of theory, and I think you could apply the same to film. Certain filmmakers, Jim Jarmusch, will have chosen to shoot in black and white when they could have afforded or could easily have filmed in colour, and there would be a very good artistic reason for making that selection.
Yeah. Or Woody Allen in Manhattan, for instance. It seems it's very difficult to see. It's hard to imagine it being made in colour. It's so much black and white.
But do you think that black and white has a reductive power, a power that reduces the elements to the graphic, and that's why we respond well to them? In fact, if I try and get my children to watch a black and white film, I mean they will, because once they get wrapped up in the narrative, they will. But their natural reluctance to watch a black and white film. I mean, we live in colour, a world of colour.
I know exactly what you mean, because my children have grown up groaning about the black and white films that their parents want to watch, and very rarely can be persuaded to look at them. And I think that's a terrible loss, and one I've not really been able to. I've never found an argument that prevailed in this area, so it's a great disappointment to me. But I think you're right. There is an element of minimalism about black and white. There is a reduction in the. I mean, we have a finite amount of attention, and if you're confronted with a very colourful scene, that takes up attentional energy, which could go in other places. And if you see something in black and white, you can see form and structure to the image that you wouldn't easily see if it was shown to you in full colour. So I'm always very happy to watch black and white films, because I'm always very interested in composition, and composition often comes through much better in black and white.
I think that you've encapsulated something there, which is well, it's about a finite amount of attention. I think that is that I've thought about this a lot. We've discussed it a lot, but I think that those words actually sum it up better than I could ever imagine. I think we should end it there, in fact. Greg,
Good.
Thank you so much. I
Thank you.
really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Enjoyed that
Great.
very much.
Good. Thank you.